There he is. Hello.
Hi, hi. How are you?
I'm happy. This worked out very seamlessly. Thanks, Raul. I was just about to introduce a little bit to say that we've picked you, of course, because we are looking forward to a discussion with an architect that is present in different parts of this world, native from India and with the office there, and at the same time professionally involved in the US as a newly appointed chair of the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. And the one thing that I was so keen to talk about with you was really this question that one thing that is so striking about this COVID-19 condition is that it's so universal. It basically affects everybody, right? And it's reported to, it's all over the press. It's in our minds. It doesn't let us sleep. It's almost a nightmare in that kind of sense. Apart from the hygienic nightmare, it's also kind of occupying all our thoughts, right? So it's very colonizing every possible thought that you can have. The interesting thing is, though, even though it's universal in the sense that it affects everybody on this planet, virtually everybody, it obviously is lived through in very different ways locally, depending on where you are. Now, it seems that the way that at least I receive it here in Western Europe on the news, it's discussed as pretty much a local phenomenon. Of course, we hear about the problems that are in the US, but we hear about how sometimes it's in Southeast Asia, how it was in China, Korea, Singapore, and so on. But we hear little about Africa. We hear little about places like Bangladesh, India, the Philippines. So there's a certain, let's say, arbitrary map of attention that is given to this phenomenon. And I think it's actually worthwhile to study these differences, how this actually materializes on the ground, how it is managed by governments, and how is it actually lived through by the people. And I was wondering if you, with your kind of buy local existence, could enlighten us a little bit about those possible differences that we might, yet need to catch up to actually understand.
Well, thank you, Andreas, and thank you for this invitation. Pleasure to be here chatting with you after a long time. Of course, these are very difficult questions. And, I think it's interesting. Normal life as we imagined it or experienced it almost seems like a miracle that we took for granted. I think you framed it really well, because I think you've kind of framed it through the lens of perception and news of the local and global, but it's also what you alluded to is this tension between how we understand the local and global. It's like a long cliche in our profession to look at the global and local and its tension, but now it kind of gets heightened in a very, very interesting way. And I think, for me, just at a very personal level, but I mean, I'm sure this resonates more broadly, what had happened was our local, and let me say as local as you can get, which is your home, was something that had become very transient in our lives. We were, living lives where we were moving around, rushing. The home was just a stopping place and a very transient space. Now it's kind of reversed, because the home and locality, and the home as an extension of locality, has become your most stable environment in a sense. And the global has become transient. It's become virtual. We would have been doing this face-to-face over a coffee or at a table at your office. But now we are accepting this other kind of reality. We are noticing things in our homes. We are noticing things on our street. We are noticing things in our neighborhoods. We are depending on it. And so there's a kind of heightened value to locality. And in some ways, an abstraction of the global, because the global is now become this hyper-virtual space. So it's interesting that this sort of tension that you describe happens at many levels. But I think more pointedly to your question, to try to analyze it perhaps, is going back to that miracle of what we thought was normal. And what was normal as life was very different in different places, right? So, and so I think every society has its own expectations, so to speak, about what that normal is and what is the deviation. I mean, look at what's happening in the US, where even our supreme leader is not wearing a mask here, and people think it's normal to go back to beaches because that's a kind of their normal vision of life in the summer, for example. But in other places, that expectation doesn't exist because what was normal life was different, and people can adjust, and therefore, in some ways, you could argue have the resilience to deal with it in a completely different way. And I think these differences, which are local, which are about localities, which are about nations, states, cities, communities within cities, is becoming very heightened now. Globalization under neoliberalism, globalization as we've developed that narrative, in some ways flattened the world when it came to expecting, well, normalcy, expecting aspirations, and setting up these in our minds. But now I think the way the pandemic and its effects as it hits the ground are so different from locality to locality that it's kind of mind-boggling. And, I'll just say, for example, we look at the slum of Dharavi in Mumbai, where it's been incredibly controlled, and it's counterintuitive to when we think about density being the problem and amenities being the problem. But they've solved the problem there. And in the US, in suburbia, which is the lowest density possible, you have the highest peaks. So it's kind of a crazy situation.
Yeah. But can we, I have a little bit of a connection issue. Sometimes I don't hear things that you say, and I try to fill in the gaps, and I hope I can make this work out, because our Wi-Fi here seems to have a little bit of a...
Maybe I'll speak slower, yeah.
But that's also fine. I love the way you talk. It reminds me really of Mumbai, when I've been there and went to one of the most amazing environments ever I've seen in my life, which was Dharavi. And I was just trying to picture, how do people in Dharavi, in an informal condition with an extremely high density, where people live and work in a proximity that is unheard of for contemporary cities in Western Europe, at least, that I've been familiar with. How does social distancing translate to conditions like this?
It doesn't. I mean, these are deadly conditions. I mean, one has to it's amazing that at least from the official news, one is hearing that the cases in Dharavi are somewhat contained. But I think that speaks more to the resilience of the folks there, the extent they have gone to wear masks, to distance themselves, even if it means going out of the house and sitting in the alley so that there are not 8 people in a house. I mean, it's the most extreme condition where something like this pandemic has played out. And, it seems from the news that they've got it sort of under control. Is it low rise and higher density that allows air to kind of move through much more easily? Because the high rise, high density that the government makes to reallocate slums for housing have incredible incidences of the pandemic, because they have inadequate light and ventilation, for example. So, I think we'll have to look at this retrospectively to really understand how, people dealt with it. But I mean, I think you rightly point out that Dharavi is an amazing case in point. And it was a frightening proposition, and which is not to say that many slums are not very badly affected and infected because of the reasons you described. And so this is, a situation which I think we'd have to reflect on retrospectively to understand how to deal with better. And if I may,
yes.
I might just sort of extend your... Sorry, if you go.
How would you define major difference?
I think it's a matter of amenities. Really, it's not a matter of density, it's a matter of amenities. And we've known the problems, the fact that you have to share a toilet, that there's not enough running water. It's very basic things like that I think could point to simpler solutions. Of course, the ideal solution is you can rethink housing, you can rethink land markets, you can reorchestrate the geography in a way that you can make more robust environments. But I think even in the short term, if one just addressed amenities, that really is the heart of the problem. And here I want to kind of make a segue because, you know, I heard a conversation we had at the South Asia Institute a few weeks ago where there was Professor Homi Bhabha, who's one of my colleagues here, who kind of flipped the question to ask whether this is really, we should be talking about the notion of preparedness. I think what this has pointed out to is unpreparedness. Maybe Switzerland was better prepared than anyone else, and therefore you guys are back in the cafes. But many countries were not prepared. And he was sort of arguing, and I think by extension, it's useful for us as designers and professional practitioners and planners to actually confront this just through asking, what does preparedness for some things like this mean? Because otherwise we are kind of making a reflex or a knee-jerk reaction to the situation. And everyone's thinking, okay, how can you make the streets wider? How can you make the sidewalks wider so people can social distance? You know, these are reactions. But I think the bigger problem that for us to maintain any agency in society is to question the notion of preparedness. And he argued, for example, civil society and the press in America wasn't prepared for Trump. Mr. Modi in India was not prepared for demonetization. The Europe was not prepared for the refugees. And so if you use that rubric, then maybe we'll think of the problem differently and more projectively rather than reactively. I think both are important, but we shouldn't forget the projective dimension when we are in a crisis like that.
Mm-hmm. But how would you describe the major differences between like a crisis response to, you know, in a developing nation such as India with extreme density, extremely big cities occasionally, and on the other hand, let's say a developed nation like the US with its current political condition? What are the major differences that make these turn out so differently?
Well, I mean, I think it's privilege. I think it's privilege of many kinds. It's privilege, political privilege. It's privilege of economy. It's privilege of just what you think in a democracy is your right. It's the privilege of having environments that you think are less susceptible to these questions. So in a place like India, where many of those privileges don't exist, and you tell the people in Dharavi that you don't leave your home, wear a mask, and these are the rules, people fall by that because they don't have the notion of privilege to hold on to. Whereas in the more affluent places, that privilege is very high and very hard to control in a democracy. You know, as what I believe what is happening in the US. And I think this is just the privilege of having those assets or those accesses. So amenities is not a problem. Of course, the hospitals are failing just because the numbers are so big. Yeah. But no one is worrying about water running in their homes and things like that, right? And those basic privileges in a slum in Mumbai, you can't even access. And so therefore, I mean, sorry, the answer to your question would be, therefore, I think where those privileges don't exist, I think states, and this is where the role of the state becomes important, can be more draconic in terms of what it, of course, Singapore is an exception, but it can be a little more draconic and effectual in terms of, you know, legislating certain kinds of norms.
Okay, I have to admit, I'm getting like 50% of what you say because of this terrible connection. I don't know what the problem is today, but I'm trying to fill in the gaps and hope my questions are not too redundant to what you've already said, and that the other people on the internet can understand you well. I hope so. Yuma, my assistant, is following this, and I hope it's fine. One thing I wanted to ask you is, India has a special culture of performative density, I would say. You have made this incredible analysis, a very beautiful filmic analysis, plus a book on Kumbh Mela, an extraordinary festival that really celebrates the congregation of bodies in space. I mean, I don't find another way to put it. Is this culture in danger of disappearing if pandemics such as this one are not just a momentary kind of thing that happens, but could come repetitively, as some scientists say they could?
No, that's an excellent question, and actually incredible, because I've been thinking myself about the relevance of that in this particular condition. And actually, I would almost just provocatively flip it and say that in a sense that I think if this becomes a recurrence that's more often, I think there's a lot of traction even in looking at those cultures much more productively. It's a question of how do we place them, correct? So, I mean, and I think that's really what the heart of our study was, and I'm glad you've kind of alluded to it because it gives me an opportunity to explain it, was you could look at this in a almost fetishistic or in an exotic way, let's say, for lack of other words, that, you know, it's millions of people who come and congregate and it's bodies in space. There's a cinematic effect that you can take a camera and shoot in any direction and you'd get the most amazing images. But I think what we tried to do in that study was to say, what is it that we can extract from within the framework, within the theoretical frameworks, within the operational frameworks of planning discourse. And therefore, what do you then see? If you apply that lens, what do you see? And I think what the study did really was use that lens to extract from what seemed, I mean, I always say that it was the most efficient and the cleanest Indian city I've ever visited. And I visited a lot of Indian cities. And so there was something there that we knew had embedded lessons, right? And so, you know, there are many things. Simplistic ones are that it was laid out on a grid, that only 5 or 6 materials, like a kit of part, developed it so it could be assembled and disassembled very quickly. You know, the efficiency of the infrastructure, the mobility systems because of the grid, and every line on the grid crossing the river across a bridge. So, you know, there were some very, what we would normally discuss in urban design as very applicable lessons. Then you go further into questions of politics and governance, and then many other very interesting things emerge. But I'll just touch upon 2, because otherwise this will become a lecture on the comment. One is that I think it's a wonderful model of public-private partnership in terms of how the government lays out a grid which is robust, which creates a platform through which many individuals can relate to each other and self-organize within that grid in allocated metrics, correct? So I think one can take that whole lesson and unpack it in very productive ways for emergencies, for crises, for governance. But for me, actually, the most interesting and relevant aspect of what I learned from that study was the governance model, which is they start planning for it. I mean, people refer to it often as a pop-up city. Now, that is not an accurate description because it actually is very deliberate and it's planned for a whole year before it happens, right? And when they start planning, the chief minister of the state and the top bureaucrats, they run it as a top-down operation. And then every month, that hierarchy shifts on the circle. And so the next level of officers become in charge and they run the show, reporting only to one chief minister. And by the time the festival time arrives, the festival commissioner is the top person. And he is reporting only to 3 people. And then he can go outside that circle. So in short, to summarize that, it is a governance system on a temporal scale, which is what makes it so nimble. That is, for different conditions and for different stages of the development of the city, the hierarchy of decision-making changes till it's very grounded for the last 55 days. Now, that's a very interesting question because often in cities, the illusion that buildings have lasted for 300 years and the city is a very stable entity is actually a myth. the most unchangeable aspects of our city, it's its hierarchical governance system. And that's why when we talk about unpreparedness and we talk about the refugees arriving, or we talk about a tsunami that hit something, the business as usual governance systems are not nimble enough to react very quickly to these problems, right? And so I think from something like that, my greatest learning, or what is occupying my mind today to think about in the context of your question and the pandemic, is how does one work back from the governance system? Can we make a more nimble governance system? Can we have can we extend our imagination of temporality, which we have now become very good at doing as architects, when we look at environments, and temporality has become, I think, something we see as being productive. But can we extend that imagination of temporality even into governance systems, and then work backwards from there in terms of what is the form of the city? I think it's thinking about these questions in this manner will help us simultaneously balance what might be reactive impulses towards what the pandemic is presenting as challenges, but also projective aspects of what can we learn from this, and what are the traces that what we do today will leave for the future, right? In the same way as we are teaching virtually, or we are doing this virtually, I think this phenomena is going to leave a trace. I can bet on it that your museum will start doing things even when we become normal, in a way that you leverage the power of convening people through the virtual. So I think the question we should be asking is, what do we invest in as professionals in our imagination that will actually leave a productive trace for the future? And I think governance is one such aspect.
Yeah. I was wondering, Rahul, there was a lot of criticism to the lockdown measurements that were imposed by the Indian government, especially with respect to informal populations, people that live in precarious conditions. They're very dependent on daily jobs, who actually need to go out to get a job for the day, to earn the money to buy the food that will actually make it to the next day. So these are people that are really depending on a very immediate contact to space. They need to expose themselves to be visible, to actually get work and get a survival. And this entire population has, of course, been hit in super violent ways by a very mechanically imposed and brutally imposed lockdown. Now, I'm wondering if a country and a culture like India is able to manage a situation that is so out of the ordinary, such as the festival of Kumbh Mela. Wouldn't these people, the same people, you know, the festival commissioner festival, be able to define a corona response that is more intelligent than just forcing people to stay at home?
Oh, well, no, that's a tough question, but I mean, an incredibly well put question, and thank you for even asking it. You know, I mean, my one word answer would be unprepared. And so then I must, in the context of India, unpack what that one unpreparedness might mean. So, you know, the Kumbh Mela, I think they're prepared for the Kumbh Mela. They know it's been happening for 5,000 years, sort of. So they know it's happening. They expect it. But I think for this situation, they were unprepared. And so I think if one digs deeper, what were they unprepared about? What is the government unprepared about? And I think in my own analysis, it's two aspects. One is it's unprepared to accept the reality that the informal sector and the informal economy in a country like India is over 75%. I mean, people argue between 70 and 90%. And so therefore, they are completely unprepared, or they don't have space in their imagination as a government to accept that informality is such a big chunk of people's existence and daily lives, right? Mm-hmm. So that is, I would say, at a micro kind of level, people vending and, you know, livelihoods on a daily basis, right? But let's look at that same mismatch in imagination at the scale of the nation. And I think, you know, and this is some of the current research we are doing, so I won't go into detail, and hopefully there'll be an occasion to share it with you and your constituency at some point in the future. But, you know, what we are doing is right now mapping and trying to see what is really urban in India, right? And you know, there are three criteria that define what is urban in India. One criteria is that it should be a settlement of 5,000 people. The second criteria is that it should have a density of more than 400 people per square kilometer. And then the third very bizarre criteria, which goes back to the 1962 census, is that 75% of the male population in settlement should be in non-agricultural employment. I think, okay. Are you with me? Yeah, okay, okay. Yeah, so Andreas, did you get to hear the three criteria? Or should I repeat it?
No, the first I heard, and then the second, 70% of the male population.
No, the first is, okay, there we go. The first is that it should be 5,000 people in that settlement. The second criteria is it should be 400 people per square kilometer as density. And the third criteria is 75% of the male population. Male population should be in non-agricultural employment. Yeah. Okay. Okay. No. So the third criteria is that 75%.
Let's try to go on.
Yeah, 75% of the male population is in non-agricultural employment. Now, that's a very bizarre criteria, which goes back to 1962, when they were looking at urban, rural, and those binaries, and many other histories. Now, it's bizarre because everyone in India is doing agriculture, or not everyone, but 400-500 million people are doing agriculture and being employed both places, and it's not 75% non-agriculture. And so as a result of that, I'll just give you a summary of the research. As a result of that, there are about 7,500 something towns, right? But if you take the criteria of over 5,000 people, India has 32,000 towns or something like that. In fact, you could and there's enough research done on this, you could argue that India for 6 months of the year is about 37% urban, and for 6 months of the year it's 47% or 48% urban, which means there's 200-300 million people who are going back and forth on a seasonal cycle, right? Now, what that implies is that the notion of flux, of movement, why the Kumbh Mela becomes again important to imagine, why we should be thinking about completely different housing typologies, is 200-300 million people are moving back and forth, which is mind-blowing in terms of a kind of number. And what we saw as a result of the lockdown and the 30 million people who went back to their villages was we saw what happens in the year happening in 1 week, essentially, correct? And so the government sorry, I'll wait to come back. Yeah. So in many ways, what we saw happening in 1 week of 30 million people doing reverse migration back to the villages is what actually normally happens on a yearly seasonal cycle anyway, but which is not recognized, right? And so therefore we are unprepared even in our imagination of what is happening either in the economy or in the way our urban systems are working. And so, I think these are the kinds of things that unless we address, it's only symbolism. It's, it's like a circus. You come out and clap and you do weird things to celebrate what might go away or something. I don't know.
Yeah. Could we talk a little bit about the, let's say the learning possibilities from this crisis for the art of urbanism, so to speak? What we see, and Anna Pujana in an earlier conversation of this series pointed out that maybe the biggest asset of cities to react to this crisis is resilience, the possibility to react, or the capacity to react to unforeseen conditions. And that this is maybe the most important asset for cities to develop today, to basically, improvise, basically, and react very spontaneously to conditions. And surprisingly enough, many also Western cities have tried to do this, for instance, by changing the traffic organization, giving more space to bicycles, understanding that cars are not so important anymore, and so on. I was wondering, you know, we live in an era where the way that we have organized cities in the 20th century has to be actually updated, importantly, in the 21st century, because we don't need as much road space anymore, as much parking space anymore, but we need much more green space. We need more housing, and we need more kind of dense urban space, but also perforated with unbuilt space. So we actually have a lot of changing to do in order to adapt our living conditions to our needs in this condition. Would you say that this kind of extraordinary condition of COVID-19 and the necessity to adapt and be resilient to it is kind of a crash course in urban resilience that would actually empower us, prove our quality, our abilities to actually meet the challenges that we would have need to meet anyway, even without this crisis? So is there some kind of surplus value that will help us in some way?
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, actually, you asked the question and also answered it, but I'm going to extend your answer, I think, in a way that might be useful for us to discuss, which is that, you know, I mean, I think what I referred to earlier in India, where you have to look at the informal economy, but you have to also look at what urban itself means, right? And I think for me, what, and I think, again, what you've described, I think, in my view, was an answer, is that these are the traces that existed, and now these traces can be accelerated and left more strategically, because this is a good opportunity to make changes which might have been harder to make in the business as usual model, right? The resistance are much greater. But, you know, I think what I'm learning from this, and one is seeing many such very good examples of re-engineering sidewalks, you know, looking at amenities differently. But I can't but help think that I think it's critical for us as professionals to imagine all these things at different scales. Otherwise, we tend to, in our reactions, get locked into one scale. And then we worry about the city, we forget the territory. Because, you know, there are some things you can solve at a small scale, vis-a-vis widening a sidewalk, right? There are some things you can solve at a middle scale, which is amenities around the city, getting new water supply systems, new energy models, new mobility. And then there's some things you can solve at a very much large territorial scale, which is how do you create more robust networks, as in the case of India we should be doing, because how do you begin to not control, but how do you begin to regulate the flux? But to regulate the flux, you need to look at the territorial scale. You can't solve it by looking at what happens in Dharavi. So I think we have to remind ourselves as professionals that we should be mindful about how we situate our solutions and our reactions for them to leave a healthy trace in the future, is that we must think simultaneously across these different scales.
I didn't quite catch the later point in your answer. Could you repeat it?
Yeah. So my point was that I think we have to be mindful as professionals that we situate our solutions at the appropriate scales. And at different scales, different solutions will leave a trace. At some scales, it has a governance implication. At some scales, it has an infrastructure implication. At some scales, it has some micro interventions which could make the difference, right? So we should be careful that we don't universalize these solutions, and at least situate them in scales. And we must think of all these scales simultaneously, because they are finally embedded in each other.
Yes. No, absolutely. It's still a bit difficult for me, but I'm very happy to watch this conversation later on, because we obviously record this, so that people can also see it later on. Of course, one thing on the back of my mind is how you experience the situation in the US. You've just started the...
No, go on.
Okay, yeah, I'm really losing bits of our conversation, but I will be able to hear what you have said later on. It's kind of funny, because we actually started this thing under a home office working regime, where I would do these conversations at home, and the internet was fine. And this is the first time I do this in my office again.
Oh.
So things need to be changed after all. No, but I was wondering, can you tell us a little bit how you experienced this condition in the US with this very specific situation in the country at large, but also with a very specific situation now in your workplace, where you deal with challenges that maybe a year ago you wouldn't have thought you would need to deal with, in terms of how can you enable your students to follow your courses and to be in the country and so on. Can you elaborate a little bit about that?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I think in the US, what's been interesting is, as in anywhere in the world, and, you know, I commend Switzerland for the kind of stability it's shown through all of this, is that finally, I think the structural cracks that existed in society only get heightened when you're under stress and in a pandemic, and, you know. And so I think in the US, the patterns are very clear, where you have intelligent and aware governors and politicians. You pretty much have things in control. Where you don't, it's going out of control. So it begins to very clearly highlight that relationship of leadership, even when all these privileges exist, right? So that's one. The other, I think what it's heightened, and you've seen with all the race protests and things, is of course the murder of Floyd heightened, but it's not like those cracks didn't exist, but they have been heightened also because the least privileged have been the ones that have been the most affected. And, you know, it's clear with the data that the Black community, because there's structural racism, institutional racism, that they have not had the same access to amenities. And therefore they are living in densities without the amenities, not different from many other parts of the world. And so that has become heightened. So these societal cracks have become heightened. And, you know, so then how does one deal with it? Of course, you know, the buck stops at the leader. I think we've all been trying to address these questions. We've been trying to have discussions about them. We've been trying to even drill deep enough to see what are those structural cracks, even within the institution. And then again, the virtual world and how we are going to, you know, tweak pedagogy and how we are going to restructure our teaching is a great moment. I don't want to use the word opportunity because that has other implications. It could be read negatively too. So therefore, this gives us the moment to kind of reinvent things, keeping in mind, and I think this is the critical thing, whether we're talking about cities or talking about institutions, is keeping in mind what are the traces this will leave. Because if we don't anticipate those traces and we don't use this moment to pivot to something different, which is more equitable, more just, and more intelligent in many ways, and addresses the question that the word that you keep using, which is absolutely right, which is resilience, then it's a moment we've thrown away. You know, as I think Paul Romer from the World Bank said, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And so it will be terrible for us as humanity if we wasted this questioning of what we've taken for granted on this planet, in a sense. Did you hear me, or did I break? Or
I kind of. It's you know, actually I'm getting the feedback from our listeners and viewers. They can understand everything perfectly. So that's the important thing.
Okay,
so maybe my questions will seem redundant at some point. It's no. It's ours. It's ours. So people are fine. Actually, it's interesting that some also ask questions, and I would actually like to read you one because it's an interesting one. It says, how do you think the situation is changing the education of the architect, the approach to cities, not only from a pedagogical perspective, but also ideologically?
Okay. Very good question, whoever asked that. So, you know, I think I use the word agency, and I think we have to go back to agency. I think when there is unpreparedness in the way I, you know, quoted my colleague, I think one of the results of unpreparedness is divisions in society and unequal divisions in society that get heightened. Yeah, I think more than ever, civil society is going to have to play a much greater role in this healing process. And the way I at society is that part of society, and I think we are all part of civil society. I think trade unions are part of civil society. I think NGOs are part of civil societies. They are that part of society that has the ability to understand the grassroots and get the pulse of the people just because of their education, their training, their awareness. But they also are blessed in terms of their exposure, their training, and their privileges to be able to negotiate with more powerful forces like the state government, the national government, the mayor, etc. Right? And so this civil society in a crisis becomes very critical. It becomes very critical for us to create a level of preparedness for the future. And we must see ourselves as architects as part of this civil society, which means then intrinsically by nature, we become bridges in a sense, right? And bridges are naturally about activism. It's about identifying problems, and it's not about sitting and waiting in an office for a job to show up, you know. It's about writing, research, publication, going on the ground. It's about understanding new patterns. So the kinds of things I pointed out that's emerging from our research about informality, about how urbanization is occurring in India, what the meaning of flux is. You know, the state doesn't do it, and the ordinary people on the ground can't do it. We are prepared to do it, and it's a responsibility, correct? So I think, I mean, architecture has always had to be socially responsible, but I think now we are on hyperdrive to use our agency in a way that we can partner and play a very conscious role in civil society to heal these differences systemically. And healing the differences is not just like Florence Nightingale or Mother Teresa, but it's healing these differences through our professional imaginations of how space can be organized in more equitable ways. What are the new forms of infrastructure? Can housing be imagined differently to create greater access? Or is it how do we make our streets and sidewalks more safe if a pandemic should occur? So again, it is operating at all those scales, but being very conscious that we have the responsibility as part of civil society to respond to this through our skill sets.
All right. I want to ask a question a little bit more specifically to this question of pedagogy and curriculum. I'll give you an example. A friend of mine, a young architect from Basel, she has a professorship somewhere in the area, and she was actually asked to teach to the students concrete construction. And she believes that actually the CO2 emission of concrete is so critical that today we should probably think twice before we do it. And she had a very interesting response to her dean when she was asked to actually, to teach students how to make concrete. She said, aren't you sure this is something more for architectural history and not for design and construction? So she was basically saying she was more interested in teaching people how to design with other materials than concrete than that, because she was saying maybe that's something of the 20th century and we need to investigate what alternatives we have today that are more apt to our climatic condition and to the challenges that come with it. So I think it's a really interesting kind of proposition from her as a young teacher to even come up with a proposal like this, to sort of refuse to disseminate knowledge that she thought was basically somewhat of the past. Is there similar things that you could imagine that maybe in 20 years, things that we no longer teach, or that new things that we would need to teach?
Oh, very much. I mean, God, it would be an amazing range of things. But let me frame it in a different way, which is that I think at every moment in time, well, you can call it a decade or a few years or however you want to collapse time. The concerns that we as architects have begin to change. And as a colleague of mine described it, he said the critical thing is how do you find that intersection between the sphere of your concern and the sphere of your influence, correct? And so often what happens, and I say this jokingly to my students a lot, that, you know, in the evening over wine, your spheres of concern just expand. You go into climate change, you worry about the planet, you worry about everything. And in the morning, you get up and, you know, you have to design some extension to a house because you have to do it to just survive. And so your influence is very minuscule, but you can expand it if you're innovative about it. And so I think we have to consciously I think, work on through pedagogy. I think if we can equip students through education and through teaching them and through the pedagogical structures of allowing them to collapse consistently their spheres of concern and their spheres of influence, it would be a very good way to imagine what pedagogy in the future would be. Now, of course, it would be difficult because, you know, how do you calibrate this? And I don't mean that you make your ambition smaller just to make your influence bigger, but you think innovatively within it. And so I think the question your colleague asked, I would say, is her concern only the emission of CO2? Is also her concern about the centralized marketing and manufacture of concrete versus its disaggregated nature for the economy? How would I unpack my set of concerns? Then I think I can have a better answer about what my influence should be and how I change it. But if I make my concern too singular, then my response is also very singular, and that's also often not helpful. And so, I mean, I think the question of concrete is an important one, but it's linked to labor, it's linked to you know, how economies are organized, it's linked to the local and global. Is it being manufactured locally or not? And so you could justify it in many ways through a series of trade-offs, but you could also make a more nuanced argument which will help you answer how you should influence that change. Otherwise, there are no magic bullets in terms of, you know, one for the other. And I think these are complicated discussions. And I think actually complexity, as we know, the other side is simplicity, but complexity is something we can't avoid in today's world. And so while we keep simplifying the question, we also in the process narrow our responses. And so I think it's healthy to complicate our questions in today's world. Somebody said once, which I think is very nice, they said, in today's world, if you're confused, it just means you're thinking clearly.
Yeah. Okay, there's two more questions I would like to follow up with before we close, because we have an hour to do this. One would be, how do you react immediately with the GST to COVID-19? Do you take this as a subject of your teaching or of interventions of studies?
Yeah, yes and no. Well, I would say, first of all, I would say yes. We've taken the COVID situation seriously at two levels. One is we were one of the first schools that clearly said for safety reasons and for reasons of equity, we are going to go virtual in the fall. We were, I think, among the first who decided that. So that, I think, it inherently begins to unpack and open up many questions and challenges for us. And the other is, of course, we want to take the COVID pandemic very seriously. But again, we want to complicate the question before we say this is the reaction to COVID, which is, I think, linked to what I said previously. And so we are, you know, addressing a broad range of issues that COVID has surfaced, all the way from what public health means in our pedagogy and what public health means for our society, what questions of infrastructure might mean, how do we imagine these differently in these questions, how do we nuance even the understanding of infrastructure and amenities, how do we then look at the kind of structural faults that have emerged as a result of the pandemic, which is racism, you know, the whole Black Lives Matter movement, and what does that mean for designers? What does that mean for cities? What does that mean for architecture? So we've had very many self-assessments. I don't call these reflections because reflections is a bit passive, but they're self-critical self-assessments where we are looking at the syllabus of all our colleagues. We are looking at it collectively. We are trying to ask, where are the gaps? Where are our blind spots? What did we miss? And so I think we're using it as an opportunity to do that. And again, I would be disappointed if we come up with a magic bullet. I mean, there have been suggestions that we must now have a core class in the beginning of the semester, which looks at race and COVID and things. But no, I think we have to be more ambitious and we have to embed these questions in our entire pedagogy. Then everyone will feel responsible for it. And so that is our approach, which is where we are. And I hope in a month or two, I might be able to share with you very specific examples from different faculty of how they've really pivoted even in the content of their issues.
Okay, there's maybe a last question we can still take, maybe coming from India. Someone asking, what is the quality of research at the GST compared to Indian architectural institutions, and if there's a gap, how could it be closed?
Oh my gosh, it's almost a
Putting
trick
you in
question. Yeah, it's like a trick question. No. I mean, look, I think I would answer this differently. Again, none of these are binary or simple answers. Universities and institutions have to be imagined as ecologies, right? The more diverse and rich those ecologies are, the more lenses you apply to a problem and a question that you ask. And so, I mean, I would say, I would not even separate the GSD out. I would say Harvard University, I must see Harvard University as an ecology. And then I am blessed to be part of that ecology because I have MIT 1 kilometer away. And that is another rich ecology. And then two ecologies overlap, right? I think the ETH in Switzerland and everything that surrounds Switzerland, different ETHs and what's happening in Basel is all one ecology. We in today's world we don't operate separately. So I mean, I think the way we should look at this, and so I can't tell you how you can just improve research per se in those institutions. I think there's very good minds in the Indian institutions, but the Indian institutions, and I'm now talking about architecture schools, the problem is they don't see themselves ecologically. So they don't, for example, create overlaps with the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, for example. Now, if you connect those, the architecture school and the Institute of Science in Bangalore connected, I mean, you would have an explosion in terms of ideas, right? And so I think we have to get away from this kind of singular lens that we apply on things when we ask research questions. I think today's technology and the way we can serve the world allows us to create ecologies that are planetary. The fact that we are having a discussion like this, we have connected two ecological sets of thinking, and hopefully something rich will come out of it in the future. And so I think it's not a matter of whether the research is better here or there. It's a matter of what ecology you're part of and what nourishes your thinking around a set of questions. And I think that's what you should aspire for if you have any influence in the institution that you're asking this question from.
All right, good. I think it's we made an interesting circle from India to the US and back, and we covered, I think, some really interesting subjects. And of course, there's a lot of stuff to go on about. But I think really what I really retain is this this amazing opportunity to redefine normality, right? What is normal, and what is essential? What do we really need? And I think a lot of your research on ephemeral urbanism shows that actually we could draw so much intelligence from it for the design of, let's quote quote unquote permanent urban.
Yeah.
That we maybe one day we will be able to actually kind of wipe out those differences and understand that the only way that the permanent can actually exist is through the ephemeral. And
right.
that ephemeral creates a permanence about it, but only if we accept it's continuous change that it brings about. And don't try to fix it to some kind of frozen normality. We would like to have hot normality, I guess.
And can I just say one thing? You know, I mean, I think what you're saying inspires me to say this, because the title of that book I did was called "Does Permanence Matter?" And I think the way I would frame what you just said is that sometimes I think we have to get to a point as professionals who are thinking about our own disciplines in a way that sometimes architecture and urban design is not the solution and it's the problem. And we have to have the courage to identify that.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Rahul. It was really nice. I would like to thank our listeners to have sit with us through this conversation. Any apologies for any kind of absent moments from myself, but it is due to a little bit of a problem of the internet. I would like to let you know that next week, in a week from now, on Thursday, 5 p.m., same time, we will be speaking to the Swiss architect Philipp Rahm, who is working in Paris and who has been doing an extremely interesting experimental practice of architecture, where he's very interested in meteorological conditions. And yeah, so he has a thing to say about this topic too, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. But Rahul, for today, thank you again, and all the best for you and for your work at the GST. Good luck. Yeah. Bye bye.
Nice talking to you, Andreas. Bye.